If you look carefully at the latest data from 2025, you'll see something that should concern us all about retirement money and the silver price surge that's unfolding right now. Silver rose 147% in 2025, 147%. This isn't just a rally in retirement planning terms. This is silver's biggest annual gain since 1979, almost half a century ago, and it has massive implications for your retirement money. In January 2025, silver cost around $29 per ounce. By year's end, it reached $72. For brief moments in December, it touched a historic record. But here's what the Money Shadow Network wants you to understand. It's not about silver. It never was about silver. If you understand incentives, you understand behavior. And when millions of Americans start accumulating a metal that traditionally serves as a hedge against uncertainty, they're telling us something about how they feel about the future. They're voting with their dollars. And the vote is simple. We don't trust what's coming for our retirement money. History teaches us that when precious metals spike like this, especially silver, which has characteristics of both a monetary and industrial metal, big changes are in motion. It's no coincidence this is happening at the same moment China implemented the biggest silver export restrictions in modern history. It's no coincidence this occurs while the Federal Reserve navigates between persistent inflation and signs of labor market weakening. It's no coincidence this happens while our industrial supply chains, from electric vehicles to solar panels, critically depend on this metal that's now under geopolitical control. Silver is telling us a story about what happens when systems we considered stable start showing cracks. A story about what happens when the consequences of decades of political and economic decisions finally meet reality. The question isn't whether we should pay attention. The question is, are we prepared for what this story is telling us about what comes next for our wealth and retirement security? History is an excellent teacher, and it teaches us that commodity crises are symptoms, not causes. In 1971, when Nixon severed the dollar from gold, silver cost around $1.30 per ounce. 8 years later, 1979 and 1980, it reached nearly 50, an increase of almost 400%. Why? Because people lost confidence in the monetary system's ability to preserve value during a period of runaway inflation, confused monetary policy, and geopolitical instability. Back then, the problem was the end of the Bretton Woods system and the discovery that the United States didn't have enough gold to honor its international commitments. Today, we have a different but equally fundamental problem. We've discovered that our globalized economy created dependencies that can be weaponized. China controls a dominant share of global silver refining and processing. This makes it a critical link in the chain. And in January 2026, it announced strict export restrictions. Only large state-approved companies with production capacity of at least 80 tons annually and credit lines of 30 million can export silver. This effectively excludes hundreds of small and medium exporters who historically supplied silver to the world. If you study economic history, you'll see this follows exactly the playbook China used with rare earths between 2000 and 2015. First, become the dominant supplier, then use that position for geopolitical influence. The result, a metal that was in structural deficit for 5 consecutive years, consuming more than producing, suddenly faces a significant supply restriction from the dominant global source. It's not a prediction, it's a logical consequence. And the logical consequences of today's policies become tomorrow's economic realities affecting your retirement planning. In December 2025, London Bullion Market Association silver stocks had fallen to their lowest levels in years. Silver lending rates in London rose to 8% to 9%, a sign of extreme stress in the physical market. What we're seeing isn't speculation. It's what happens when physical supply meets real demand in a world where Geopolitics determines who has access to what. The lesson for wealth protection is clear. When strategic resources become weapons, prices stop following purely economic logic and start reflecting geopolitical power. To understand what's happening with silver and your retirement security, you need to understand three fundamental principles that govern all economic cycles. First, supply and demand don't lie. Silver has a unique characteristic. It's simultaneously a precious metal and an industrial metal. On the industrial demand side, we have electric vehicles that use up to 2 ounces of silver per vehicle in sensors and wiring. Solar panels that consume about 20 grams of silver each. AI data centers that depend on components with high electrical conductivity. And medical devices that use silver's antibacterial properties. In 2025, industrial demand represented more than 50% of total silver consumption. And this demand is inelastic. When you're manufacturing a solar panel or electric vehicle, there's no substitute for silver in high-efficiency applications. On the supply side, we have a structural problem. Silver production comes mainly as a byproduct of mining other metals like copper, lead, and zinc. About 75% of silver is extracted this way. This means you can't simply produce more silver when prices rise. You need it to be economically viable to extract the primary metals. The result: 5 consecutive years of global deficit where the world consumes 160 to 200 million ounces more than it produces annually. This is a retirement crisis waiting to happen for those unprepared. The second principle involves credit and currency cycles. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates 3 times in 2025, bringing them to the 3.5% to 3.75% range. Projections indicate only one additional cut in 2026. Why does this matter for silver and your savings? When real interest rates are low, especially considering persistent inflation above the Fed's 2% target, non-yielding assets like precious metals become relatively more attractive. More importantly, when monetary policy signals concern about the labor market, but inflation remains stubbornly high, you have the classic conditions for alternative asset seeking. The US dollar lost nearly 95% of its value in 2025, its worst performance since 2017. This isn't coincidence. It's the result of policies that prioritize short-term growth over long-term monetary stability and wealth preservation. The third principle is that geopolitics determines resource access. We live in a world where economic interdependence, once seen as a guarantee of peace, is now recognized as a source of strategic vulnerability. China isn't restricting silver exports for environmental or capacity reasons. It's doing this for strategic reasons, following a pattern it's already applied to rare earths, tungsten, and antimony. When major business leaders publicly comment that China's silver restrictions are not good because silver is needed in many industrial processes, they're recognizing a reality. Our transition to clean energy and advanced technology depends on a metal controlled by a country in strategic competition with us. The United States declared silver a critical mineral in November 2025. China responded by treating it as strategic material in January 2026. This isn't coincidence. It's mutual recognition that whoever controls critical resources has influence over industrial and technological futures. Let me pause here for a moment, because this is more important than it seems for your financial independence. Imagine 2 American solar panel companies in March 2026. Company A had accumulated silver stocks in late 2025 when it cost $30 per ounce. Company B decided to buy as needed. In March, when Company B tries to buy silver for its quarterly production, it discovers the spot price is at $75 per ounce. Delivery times increase from 2 weeks to 3 months, and some suppliers simply don't have physical metal available. Company A can maintain its margin and stay competitive. Company B faces 2 choices: accept drastically reduced margins or stop production. Multiply this across hundreds of companies and sectors. that depend on silver, and you have a supply chain crisis that goes far beyond one metal's price. For Americans near or already in retirement, this manifests in two ways. First, directly. Many senior investors traditionally maintain a small allocation in precious metals for portfolio diversification. Those who did this in 2024 saw that portion of their portfolios grow dramatically. Second, indirectly. Companies in their stock portfolios, especially in clean technology and electronic sectors, face cost pressures that could impact dividends and future growth. More fundamentally, silver is functioning exactly as it should, as a barometer of system confidence. When it spikes 147% in 1 year, it's signaling that something has changed in perceptions of stability and economic predictability. If you're over 50 and planning or already in retirement, you need to understand how this silver dynamic connects to your daily concerns about inflation and retirement. Inflation remains stubbornly above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, even after years of supposedly restrictive monetary policy. Part of the answer lies in the deglobalization we're witnessing. China's silver restrictions are just one example of how the global economy is fragmenting into blocks that prioritize security over efficiency. When you need to seek alternative suppliers for critical materials, costs rise. When you need to maintain larger inventories to protect against supply interruptions, costs rise. This isn't temporary inflation caused by excessive demand. This is structural inflation caused by the reorganization of the global economic system. For you, this means your savings purchasing power will be eroded not just by traditional monetary creation methods, but by the growing costs of operating in a less efficient world. The transition to renewable energy, which theoretically should make energy cheaper long-term, may become more expensive if necessary materials are under geopolitical control. Your domestic energy costs may be affected not just by traditional energy policies, but by material availability for building and maintaining renewable infrastructure. What the silver situation teaches us is that we live in an era where financial security can no longer be guaranteed just through traditional financial asset diversification. You need to think about geographic diversification, currency diversification, and yes, diversification into assets that maintain value independent of traditional financial systems. This doesn't mean becoming a prepper or abandoning the financial system. It means recognizing the system is undergoing fundamental changes that require adapting strategies for long-term investing and wealth building. Based on the principles we've discussed, here are practical guidelines for Americans concerned about long-term financial stability and retirement planning. Most financial advisors talk about diversification across asset classes, stocks, bonds, real estate. But when all these classes depend on the same monetary system and the same global supply chains, you don't have real diversification. Real diversification means some exposure to assets that maintain value regardless of monetary policies, positions in companies that benefit from deglobalization, not just those harmed by it, and consideration of currencies and assets from countries that are suppliers, not just consumers of critical resources. For silver specifically, a 5% to 10% allocation in physical precious metals can function as insurance against monetary and geopolitical instability. It's not an investment to get rich. It's a hedge against low probability but high impact events that could devastate unprepared retirement portfolios. We're at the beginning of a deglobalization cycle that could last decades. This means strategies that work during the accelerated globalization period won't necessarily work going forward. Understanding changing world order dynamics is critical. Deglobalization cycles historically favor domestic producers over importers, companies with simple supply chains over companies with complex chains, and physical resources over financial assets during stress periods. This doesn't mean abandoning traditional investments. It means adjusting proportions and having realistic expectations about returns in a less efficient, but potentially more locally stable world. Liquidity isn't just having money in the bank. In an environment of persistent inflation and possible monetary instability, liquidity is having access to value that can be exchanged for real goods and services. This can include some cash for short-term emergencies, physical precious metals that can be sold locally, assets that generate real returns even during inflation, and skills and relationships that maintain value regardless of economic conditions. Personal finance decisions increasingly depend on understanding not just domestic economics, but global geopolitics. Questions you should be asking: where do materials that companies in my portfolio depend on come from? Which countries control those materials? How might changes in relationships between those countries affect my investments and retirement income? This requires different financial education than was necessary in recent decades when we could assume global supply chains were stable and efficient. Commodity markets are volatile, and silver especially so. The fact it rose 147% in 2025 doesn't mean it will continue rising indefinitely. But the fundamental lesson remains. When systems we considered stable show signs of stress, it's time to question basic assumptions about how the world works and how to protect wealth. Silver may rise or fall from here, but the trend toward deglobalization and competition for critical resources will likely continue for years. Your strategy should be built to navigate this reality, not to bet on a specific outcome. Don't make dramatic portfolio changes based on a single event or indicator, but start gradually adjusting for a world where geopolitics matters more than it has in recent decades for asset allocation and risk management. Start with a small position in physical precious metals. Notice how it feels to have something tangible that doesn't depend on promises from financial institutions. Gradually educate yourself about companies that benefit from supply security trends. Think about skills and relationships that maintain value across different economic scenarios. The goal isn't to become a commodities expert. The goal is to develop resilience in a world that's becoming less predictable, but where fundamental economic principles of supply, demand, incentives, and consequences continue operating. When the Money Shadow Network looks at what happened with silver in 2025, we see much more than a precious metals price movement. We see confirmation of a principle observed over decades studying economic cycles and macroeconomics. When systems become too complex and interdependent, they also become more fragile. Globalization gave us extraordinary efficiency. It allowed a solar panel to be manufactured with silver extracted in Peru, refined in China, transformed into components in Germany, and installed in Texas, all at a cost that would be impossible if each step were done locally. But this efficiency came with a price dependence. And dependence, when geopolitical relationships deteriorate, transforms into vulnerability. Silver isn't rising because it's magically more valuable than it was 2 years ago. It's rising because the world is rediscovering that having physical access to critical materials matters more than having financial access to paper contracts promising those materials. This is a timeless lesson every civilization learns, forgets, and relearns. There's no free lunch. The efficiency of a globalized system came at the cost of dependence on countries that may not share our interests. Debt finance growth came at the cost of vulnerability to monetary policy changes. Supply chain optimization to minimize inventories came at the cost of fragility to interruptions. Silver, ironically, is teaching us about gold, not the metal, but the golden rule of economics. You can't have sustainable prosperity without solid fundamentals. And solid fundamentals ultimately are about real resources, reliable relationships, and reserves for difficult times. If you understand this lesson, if you understand we're living through the transition from an optimization era to a resilience era, then you'll understand not just why silver rose, but why this is just the first of many repricings we'll see in coming years as part of the big debt cycle. The question isn't whether you should buy silver. The question is whether you're prepared to live in a world where geography matters again, where relationships between countries determine prices as much as supply and demand, and where efficiency may be a luxury we can't always afford. The future won't be simpler than the past, but it may be more honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is always the best foundation for sound financial decisions and retirement preparation. Silver is telling us that this more honest and more uncertain future has begun. The question is, are we listening? Are we preparing for what comes next? And that's why this was never a video about silver. It was about learning to recognize the moment when the world changes before it changes, so you can protect your retirement, preserve your wealth, and secure your financial future.